Hello and welcome back. This is Kavya and we are going to learn today the chapter 2 or unit 2 from block 2 MPC005 research methods subject of first year MA psychology. So this chapter is called ex post facto research. So again, as I always say, we are looking at this from the point of view of exam preparation. So have your textbook with you and also note that I will be discussing the areas which have been repeatedly asked in the exams. So we all this block, the block 2 is discussing about various types of research, and this is the second type of research. The first one was survey research and this is ex post facto research. Okay, so we are going to understand what are the types of research or forms of research design. So there are two design forms. One is called prospective research design and other is called retrospective research design. So when the researcher is trying to find a future result after treating the independent variable and then trying to find out what will be the effect and the future result of it, that is called as a prospective research. For example, if somebody is smoking and understanding what impact smoking causes on their body under different conditions or how it can cause cancer. So that is a prospective study. So the independent variable or the smoking is happening, and that's happening under different conditions, or they need to take subjects who are exposed to different conditions, different lifestyle, different age, different gender, something like that, and then they see what the result is on incidence or occurrence of cancer. So that is a prospective study. And now retrospective study means, similar to the word retrospective, the effect has already taken place. So that is, the researcher tries to trace the history to find out the reason behind an event. So result has already occurred and the research is trying to find the causes behind it. An example is, if a researcher is trying to understand why a person is having cancer. So they're trying to find out the possible reasons. Smoking could be one of the cause. Heredity could be another cause. Environmental factor could be another cause. Then there could be multiple causes. So here the research is trying to find out what independent variable and how it has changed to produce the result of cancer. So that is a retrospective research design. So ex post facto research is a retrospective research. So we are going to understand the concept and meaning of ex post facto research. This has been a repeated question. So ex post facto research is a research where the researcher predicts the causes behind the effect which has already happened. So if a child is delinquent means when a child shows criminal activities, then to find the reason behind it, researcher tries to find the various events that have occurred and the possibilities that contributed to such a behavior. Expected possibilities could be lack of discipline at school, some family history, peer effect, neighborhood effect, something like that. So the interesting point here is that the researcher predicts a cause on the basis of a controlled effect. Okay, the effect has already been controlled and no variation can be done on the effect, and no further tweaking or manipulation of the independent variable can also happen because the result has already happened. So ex post facto research is defined as empirical investigation which does not involve the researcher's control over independent variables, because it cannot be manipulated. Result has already happened. The conclusions are inferred without intervening or varying the independent or dependent variable. So some researchers have said that this is an experiment where the researcher, instead of finding a treatment, examines the effect of a natural occurring treatment after it has happened. Most serious danger of ex post facto research is that the conclusion made when there are multiple factors happening together. So one could be the cause and one could be effect. So we may not always be able to find out the right cause or the right interaction between the independent and dependent variable, because we were not able to control it or manipulate it. So the next question, so the concept and meaning, so you need to understand it is a retrospective research. So we are trying to find out the reasons after an event has happened. The independent or dependent variable cannot be controlled. Researcher has no control. Researcher just tries to find out the reasons from literature, from other ideas, etc. So what are the characteristics of ex post facto research? This is also a repeated question. So ex post facto research is also called as causal comparative research. So you're comparing the causes. So that's why it's called causal comparative research. So we are going to see the different characteristics. Research has control or a comparison group. Since the research has already been, research is done on the basis of the study of the cause, which has already created some effects. So the researcher has to have a control group which can be used to compare with the actual experimental group to analyze the cause of an event. So we have a group wherein they've already been practicing smoking and we've already seen that they have cancer, and we have another control group who may have cancer but who may not have smoked at all, and then we are trying to understand what is the difference, something like that. So there should be a control group to compare the result. Next is the behavior, action, event or the treatment or the independent variable cannot be manipulated or changed. So this is what we've been explaining in the concept and meaning, that is the behavior, the action, event, treatment or independent variable cannot be changed because it has already happened. And third is that the researcher focuses on the effects. So the focus is on the event or the phenomenon that has already happened. A detailed study of the phenomena or the event is done to understand the cause behind it. Next is the researcher tries to analyze how and what aspect of an event. So researcher tries to understand the causal effects behind the phenomena, focuses on the what all reasons and how did these reasons cause this phenomena to happen or cause this event to happen. Next is that it explores possible effects and causes. So what all are the possible effects, what all are the possible causes, all of these are going to be explored and examined here. So the characteristics of ex post facto research is that research has a control or comparison group. The behavior, action, event, independent variable or the treatment cannot be manipulated or changed. The research focuses on the effects, therefore. Researcher tries to analyze how and what of the event, and researcher also explores all possible causes and effects. So when we see this, we need to really understand how different an ex post facto research is from experimental research. So experimental research will be the next chapter. So here we are seeing the differences between ex post facto research and experimental research, and this is also a repeated question. So both experimental research and ex post facto research try to investigate relationship between the variables and the conclusions are logically and empirically valid and reliable. So these are the similarities. So for both experimental and ex post facto research, we are going to understand the relationship between the variables, and whatever relation, whatever understanding that we have will be logically and empirically valid and reliable. But there still are few differences, 1, 2, 3, 4. Four differences have been mentioned in the table here. So first point of difference is control over independent variable. So in an experimental research, the researcher, so experimental research is a prospective research. So we are trying to understand the results after we have manipulated the independent variable. So in an experimental research, the researcher directly manipulates the independent variable to examine the effect. But for a ex post facto research, researcher cannot directly manipulate the independent variable, and hence have to predict the cause on the basis of the dependent variable. Next is principle of randomization. So randomization refers to random sampling. So in experimental research, the researcher uses the principle of randomization so that they can conclude or infer that when everything else is remaining equal, the controlled effect is a result of the manipulation. So because they are ensuring randomization in an experimental research, we can say that whatever impact we are seeing, it is only because of the manipulation that we are causing on the independent variable. In an ex post facto research, the researcher cannot use the principle of randomization and they have no direct control over the cause, and they just infer the possible causes based on the effects seen. Next is manipulation of variables. So by now it should be very clear. In an experimental research, the researcher can manipulate, and in an ex post facto research, the researcher cannot manipulate variables. Interpretation, it is easier to interpret and infer relationships between independent and dependent variables because there is a direct manipulation happening in the experimental research and they can directly see the effect. When it comes to ex post facto research, it is difficult to interpret as there can be more than one possibilities or causes for a particular effect. As we already said, this is one issue that can happen with ex post facto research. So we are again going to see the differences between experimental and ex post facto research. One is on the control of independent variable. Second is on the principle of randomization. Third is on manipulation of variables. And fourth is on the interpretation of results. So now we will see this topic, essentials or requisites for inferring causal relationships. So this has not been a repeated question. This has not been asked till now, but we'll definitely see it because that will help us understand the next topic. So to understand and infer the cause-effect relationship, few essential things need to be understood. One is associative variation, which means if we have to infer that a particular cause X caused an effect called Y, there should be an association between them. So we can come to a conclusion only after examining that variation in X will actually lead to variation in Y. Another important topic is systematic order of events. So events need to follow a systematic order. So if X causes Y, then X has to always happen before or at least along with Y and never after Y. And the third important requisite to understand the causal relationship is absence of other causes. That is, when the researcher analyzes the aspect of causal relationship, they should find the best possible cause and they should understand that there could be other reasons and they should be able to eliminate it. Okay. So the important or essential or basic requirements to understand how we can find the causal relationship, because in an ex post facto research, the result has already happened. So now we have to find out. So to find out, we have to see three things. One is that there should be an associative variation. So when X changes, the Y also changes. That relation should be there if we are trying to find out if X actually caused Y. And then the order in which things happen. So if we are assuming that X has caused Y, then X should have happened either before Y or along with Y and never after Y. And the third is absence of other causes. If we are assuming X causes Y, we should make sure that if we see that few other variables are there, say A and B and C, etc., we should make sure that A, B, C, etc. does not cause Y and only X causes Y. So all these are important to give us a valid, reliable, logical understanding in an ex post facto research so that we can make a correct prediction during an ex post facto or a retrospective research. So now the steps of ex post facto research. So in the previous chapter, we were discussing the steps of a survey research. So here also we will have the steps and we have to understand how much difference is there, what is the significance. So here based on the kind of research you do, even though overall the steps might be similar, there would be certain differences, and that is key. So ex post facto research process is systematic and follows a definite sequence. The first sequence is determining the problem. So it is necessary for the researcher to focus on the problem and not just find the problem. They also need to determine, analyze and define the problem that they want to deal with. Step 2 is literature review. This is a very, very important step here, because the researcher needs to study all related and similar literature and relevant studies to help in further analysis, prediction, conclusion for the causal relationship. Third is formulation of hypothesis. So with the literature review, now they have to propose possible solutions. Also a very important step in this. Propose possible solutions or alternatives that could have caused this effect. List out these assumptions, and then based on this make the hypothesis and then plan the procedure for the research. Next step is designing the approach. So once they have decided the problem, now they have to select the sample which fits the criteria of the study, select the scale and construct the instrument for collecting the data. Once the design is finalized, the analysis needs to be done. The next step 5 is validity of the research. Validity of research is very important everywhere, but here we are adding it as a step compared to all other research processes. Here the researcher needs to validate the significance of the research. They need to be cautious regarding the extent to which the findings would be valid and significant and helpful in interpreting and drawing inferences from the obtained result. That is, validity of the research is extremely important, because here we do not get to control the independent variable at all. Step 6 is interpretation of conclusion. The researcher needs to analyze, evaluate, interpret the information and select the best possible alternative cause, which could have been the reason for whatever event that has happened. So when everywhere we are saying interpretation, conclusion is important, but here we also need to mention, when you say the interpretation of the conclusion, we need to say that analyze the different causes and say which is the best suited cause or the causal relationship here. So it must be remembered that even though ex post facto research is a valid method, this type of research has shortcomings, that only some limited level of control is possible here. So I'm going to go through this again. The steps of ex post facto research: determine the problem, literature review, very important, formulation of hypothesis, designing the approach, validity of the research, again very important, and interpretation of conclusion. Strengths and weaknesses of ex post facto research. This has not been asked in the past, and this is a question that is again repeated. The steps and strengths and weaknesses of all types of research design are given in these chapters, and this is a very important part of learning this topic. So the strengths of ex post facto research: 1, it is relevant in behavioral research where we cannot manipulate behaviors, that is educational issues, something like achievements or lack of achievements, or behavior like delinquency or criminal attitude. All of these are issues wherein we could not have controlled or manipulated the variable. So this is a very relevant method for such behavioral studies. It is more useful than experimental research when we want to analyze the cause on the basis of effect. So when we have to analyze the cause on the basis of some effect that is already seen, then it is more valid and relevant than the experimental research. And it is less time consuming and economical, because we are not devising instruments to collect data, especially by manipulating the independent variables. So no system has to be created to manipulate variables. So this becomes slightly less time consuming and more economical. So, and then the researcher gets a chance to analyze the opinion and come with the best possible conclusion. The weaknesses of this method include no opportunity to manipulate the independent variables, cannot give any random assignment, no randomization is possible, and sometimes the researcher cannot provide a reasonable explanation if there are multiple interacting variables. So these are the strengths and weaknesses. And then there is a concept of post hoc fallacy. So post hoc fallacy is actually a bias. So when predicting the causal relationship, the researcher can fall prey to a particular bias, and this bias is called as post hoc fallacy. So it means that the tendency of human to arrive at conclusion of prediction when two factors go together, that is, one is cause and the other is effect. Okay, that is post hoc fallacy means. Post hoc fallacy is identified as a bias. Bias means something that we think is happening. It may be true, it may not be true, but we tend to think that such a thing is happening. That's a bias, and this bias is called post hoc fallacy. The post hoc fallacy means that when we see that there is a cause and an effect, there is a basic human tendency to think that this cause itself caused this effect. This is a bias that can happen in the case of ex post facto research. The example here is because delinquency and parenthood go together, we think that delinquency is the effect and parenthood is the cause, whereas in reality, peer group could be the actual reason. Okay, so this sentence might be confusing, so I'll explain it in detail. So when we think about delinquency, that is attitude to have or attitude of criminal behavior, or when a person shows criminal behavior, because there has been some literature where we already hear that it could be because of poor parenting, and we see that in a particular case when we are trying to understand a particular person or particular community, and we see that there is criminal behavior or there is criminal tendency, or when we are taking a sample of criminals and see that they have criminal tendency, because we already know that improper or bad parenting could be a cause, we try to find out if there's already bad parenting, and we try to find out examples of bad parenting. So this is a post hoc fallacy that the researcher may have, because they already know that this is something that could happen. But in this case, in this particular case, maybe that is also there or that is seen to some extent, but the actual stronger cause here could be the peer group. But we tend to miss it as a researcher. We may tend to miss it because of the bias of post hoc fallacy. So that is the concept of post hoc fallacy. So with this, we come to the end of this chapter. Thank you. We'll see in the next chapter.